I'm here with Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of the Duran. Alexander, let's talk about a meeting that Russian President Vladimir Putin had in Moscow with the Premier of State Council of China, Li Keqiang. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. He is the equivalent, he would be the equivalent of the Prime Minister of China, correct?
That's exactly right. He is the head, he is the person who manages the Chinese economy. So his direct equivalent in Russia would be Dmitry Medvedev. Right. And he is number 2 in the Chinese leadership. By the way, I understand that his name is pronounced Li Keqiang.
Li Keqiang.
The Q is pronounced in pinyin as slightly differently.
Yeah, well, we're never good with names here.
No, of course not.
We try.
We try, and I'm sure our viewers will bear with us.
Well, here's a name we're really good at. We're really good with Macron. And the interesting part about this meeting was Putin's statement. And that statement had to do with Macron and a lot of the courtship that France and the EU has been, giving towards Russia. And Alexander, take us into Putin's statement, which is really the interesting part, and how that ties into French President Emmanuel Macron and the European Union.
Right, now we've discussed all this at some length in previous programs. Briefly, Macron, over the last few weeks, and in fact this is a policy that he's been following ever since he became president of France, has been trying to court the Russians, to court Russia very hard. And he's been meeting Putin. He had meetings with Putin in which he spoke at extraordinary length to Putin about how Russia is a European country, how Russia must prioritize its relations with the West, how Russia's future lies in Europe and in the West. And this theme has been picked up by the French foreign minister, who's had very close meetings with Russian foreign minister Lavrov. And it's also been picked up by the German foreign minister, who's been echoing some of these comments. And of course, it's also been echoed, these comments, these views about Russia having to sort of rejoin the West, have been finding some echoes in the United States also. Our viewers may recall, and we've discussed it also in previous videos, that there was a long editorial, or rather an op-ed, in the New York Times, written by the New York Times editorial board, in which they spoke about the great importance of a rapprochement between the United States and Russia, an improvement of relations between the United States and Russia. Now, all of these moves have a very obvious and transparent agenda. At this moment in time, both the United States and Europe, the West collectively, if you like, have become increasingly alarmed at the growth of what everybody now admits is an effective alliance between China and Russia. And in the United States, they've come increasingly to see China as the US's main geopolitical adversary, and the Europeans, the European Union, of which Macron is now making a strong pitch as its leader, are also becoming increasingly concerned that with this alliance between China and Russia, the European Union is losing that partnership with Russia, which was vital for its economic future, that was vital for Europe to consolidate its relationship with Russia and its access to Russia's enormous raw materials. Now, if you remember, a couple of years ago, the European Union was almost the only customer for Russian oil and gas. Most of the oil and gas from Russia came to Europe. The Europeans became extremely complacent about this. They assumed that the Russians would never find other customers. The Russians have now built huge pipelines both to supply gas and oil to China, and increasingly the Russian energy complex is shifting away from Europe towards China. And this is causing the Europeans grave concern. So the Europeans are becoming worried about loss of their economic and political relationship with Russia, at the same time as the US is becoming worried about loss of its geopolitical relationship with Russia in relation to the new rivalry that both the EU and the US have towards China. So they've been trying to draw Russia away from China. This is what Macron's various comments are all about. When he talks about Russia being a European country, what he is in effect saying is that Russia's natural ally is Europe and, in a sense, the West, and China is not its natural ally, and Russia should reorient its entire foreign policy away from China towards the West, and should seek a rapprochement with the West. I should add, by the way, that that's what Donald Trump's suggestions about Russia rejoining the G7 is all about. Well, the Russians have listened to all of this. They're always very polite people. They've not commented directly to Macron, but now we've had a meeting between Putin and the Li Keqiang, the Prime Minister of China, obviously carefully arranged between the Russians and the Chinese in response to all these various discussions that we've been hearing in the West and all these overtures and advances that have been made towards Russia. And we now have, over the course of this meeting, the Russians' reply. And I'm going to quote exactly what Putin said. He said many things, but these are the key words. The first, this addressed to, as I said, the Chinese Prime Minister in this meeting where, the two of them are sitting opposite each other. And this is a readout from the Russian government's own website. This is what Putin said. I would like to note that a very long distance has been covered in the history of bilateral cooperation over the past decades. Today, we, that is to say, China and Russia, really are strategic partners in the full sense of the word, and are implementing a comprehensive partnership that remains Russia's unconditional foreign policy priority. And then he goes on to say, I'm confident that you can see our efforts on the part of Russia aimed at expanding Russian-Chinese ties across all areas. And then he goes on to say, the only thing I would like to say is that our interaction is, of course, the most important factor in international affairs and has become an important part of expanding our economies and achieving our state's goals to improve our people's living standards. Now, that is a crushing, comprehensive reply to all the things Macron, the French foreign minister, the German foreign minister, the New York Times' editorial board, even Donald Trump have been saying. What Putin is saying in these comments is that for Russia, China remains the key, most important ally. They've been expanding, they've been working at improving their relations, the history of bilateral relations over the past decades. This has been a long, work. It's been a long established development of this relationship. We really are strategic partners in the full sense of the word. By that, he means they're actually allies. We are implementing a comprehensive partnership. In other words, that covers every area of relations: economic, foreign policy, intelligence, defense, you name it. It's a comprehensive partnership, and that remains Russia's unconditional foreign policy priority. In other words, the French, the Germans, the Americans, whoever can say whatever they like, can make whatever offers they want. Russia's priority is, and it will continue to be, its relationship with China. And I think that is a comprehensive answer, to use Putin's language, to all these overtures that have been coming from Macron and co. And it's also Russia's comprehensive rebuttal of all the nonsense we've been hearing from Macron about how Russia is a European country and how its natural alliance is with the West. We said it many times on our programs. We said that in terms of the relationship with Russia, the West has missed the bus. The train, if you like, to change the metaphor, has left the station. The Russian-Chinese alliance is now, in effect, a done thing and unbreakable. And now you've got the words from the man himself. Putin himself has spoken out, and the meaning of his words could not be clearer.
I mean, let's take a step back, Alexander. Let's go back 5-10 years as to how this all started. I mean, Obama initially wanted to do a pivot towards Asia. He wanted a reboot with Russia. And remember Hillary Clinton and Lavrov and the famous, reboot button gaffe. And from there, from that point on, things didn't go as planned. I mean, it actually turned out that the West started targeting Russia and kind of, looked away at what China was up to. And, you had Ukraine, you had Obama driving this huge campaign of Russophobia and being anti-Russian that was driven by the Obama administration. European Union, put sanctions on Russia. You had the accession of Crimea to the Russian Federation. I say accession. Some people like to label it as annexation, but in essence, it was an accession into the Russian Federation. And then you have the election of Donald J. Trump. And I know people in the comments are going to say, we're Trump apologists and we're Putin apologists, all this stuff. Fine, I get it. But Trump had it right. His instincts served him well because he said many times, I want to have better relations with Russia. He was very, very clear about that when he was campaigning. And my sense, Alexander, was that a large portion of the American public wanted the same. They didn't see any utility in having this Russia be an enemy, narrative that was driven by Obama. But then you had Russiagate, and that derailed everything. Russia continued to build its alliance with China. You started to put more and more sanctions on Russia. And lo and behold, here we are today. And you have Macron, the new de facto leader of the European Union, saying, you know what, Russia, come back. Putin's made it clear. Is Macron going to listen? Is Trump going to say, you know what, we can still negotiate with them? Are we going to see different policies coming from Europe and the United States? Where do we go from here? Because to me, just to sum it up, this wasn't supposed to happen.
Yes.
But here we are.
Indeed. Well, I think you've summed it up, actually, extremely well. Let's start with Obama, because this is where all the real problems, in my opinion, begin. I mean, the Russians were already very unhappy with many of the things that happened in Europe up to the point of Obama coming along. They were very angry when Bill Clinton broke the promise the US gave them at the beginning of the 90s and started to expand NATO into Eastern Europe, into the territories of the former Warsaw Pact. They were very angry when George W. Bush tore up the ABM treaty, the anti-ballistic missile treaty.
Serbia and Yugoslavia, just to go back to Clinton.
Serbia and Yugoslavia, all of that. You're quite right to bring that up. That was a huge event for the Russians. They were very angry, as I said, about George W. Bush tearing up the ABM treaty, planting anti-ballistic missile interceptors in Eastern Europe, talking about drawing Ukraine and Georgia into NATO, drawing the Baltic states into NATO. But Obama comes along and he tells the Russians, all this is going to change. My focus now is on China. I'm pivoting towards Asia. I'm going to start a reset with you. And what happened? The Russians say, fine. They agree a strategic arms reduction treaty with Obama on the assumption that those ballistic missile interceptors are going to be withdrawn from Eastern Europe. The ballistic missile interceptors stay. They make a call to Obama for a comprehensive reworking of the security architecture in Europe to accommodate Russian concerns. Obama ignores it. And of course, what then happens is you have the Maidan coup in Ukraine with Victoria Nuland traveling to Kiev, handing out the cookies, and the United States picking the government of Ukraine, overthrowing the constitutional democratic government of Ukraine, and then when the Russians object, when Crimea secedes from Ukraine and unites with Russia, which is what actually happened, and when there's an uprising in the Donbass in eastern Ukraine, they slap these massive sanctions against Russia. So the Russians at that point obviously start to forge their alliance with China in earnest. Their relations with China by this point are already very good. But no one at this point is talking about an alliance, at least not in Moscow. And then Donald Trump comes along, exactly as you say, and he says, all this policy is wrong. It's all a mistake. We need Russia because Russia is the pivot. Russia is the country that will decide who holds the balance, who is the stronger in this new conflict that's arising. And he wants to improve relations with Russia. And what happens? Exactly as you say, we see Russiagate, we see more and more sanctions piling on in the United States. We see this extraordinary Russophobic hysteria spreading all over the West, which Macron, by the way, plays a big role in encouraging. We all tend to forget that during the French presidential election, which we run, he won. He ran as the anti-Russian candidate, placing restrictions on RT and on Sputnik and on other Russian TV and media channels. And of course, he played a big role in all of this. Now, suddenly, they all wake up to the fact that the Russians are still there. Their economy is still growing. Their industrial output, we just had more figures, by the way, coming out of Russia. Their industrial output has been growing strongly all this year. And their alliance with China is getting ever deeper. And the whole Trump policy of squaring up to the Chinese, trying to isolate them, putting the Chinese in a position of weakness by imposing tariffs on them, forcing the Chinese to accept American leadership, is all going awry because the Chinese have the Russians at their back, and the Russians are providing the Chinese with all that oil and gas and food and raw materials which previously was flowing to Europe. And he wants to change it all, and it's now too late. You are absolutely right. Donald Trump may be a man who makes many mistakes. He may be someone who is not experienced in the conduct of affairs. But on this, he was right. And people didn't listen to him and didn't allow him to do what he wanted to do. And now we're looking at the consequences.
All right, Alexander, wrap it up. Where do we go from here? What do you think, this will lead us to?
Well, I've just been following the news coming out of Moscow and Beijing. Obviously, Putin and Li Keqiang had many things to say to each other. And by the way, I should make it very clear that I think this meeting between these two was arranged at short notice, specifically in order to counter, as a response to all the nonsense that's been coming from Macron. But behind all of this, we see more and more information now pouring out. We've now learned that the Russians and the Chinese are in discussions now that they're agreeing to move ahead with a comprehensive military partnership. Military partnership? That sounds to me like a military alliance. We understand that they are also moving forward with a joint space program which will involve joint exploration of the moon. I mean, symbolic perhaps, but perhaps not so symbolic. There's obviously a huge surge in economic relations, which is intensifying. The Chinese and the Russians, various Russian companies are now heavily developing Russia's e-commerce sector, where the Russians are behind the Chinese. And there's a huge amount of technology transfer going on. And then something else happened on Thursday in the UN Security Council, which is that the Russians and the Chinese proposed to the UN Security Council for the first time a joint draft plan for the settlement, for the pacification of Idlib province in northwest Syria. I mean, the Chinese and the Russians have often coordinated their positions on the Security Council before, but I think this is the first time that they've taken a joint step in a conflict like this by proposing together a joint plan in the UN Security Council. What is happening is that this alliance between the Chinese and the Russians has now evolved beyond the point of being something people only talk about, out of the sides of their mouths in whispers. It's now becoming an open thing in world affairs. I repeat what Putin said. The only thing I would like to say is that our interaction is, of course, the most important factor in international affairs, and that this alliance between the Eurasian powers has now become an established and enduring fact, and that we are no longer in a unipolar world dominated by the United States, but we are back to bipolarity, with the United States and its allies on one hand, the Russians and Chinese and the other Eurasian states on the other, soon to be joined by countries like Iran, and in a situation where for the first time the United States finds itself outmatched in industrial resources. So this is what the foreign policy of Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Angela Merkel, in a previous incarnation, Emmanuel Macron, his predecessor, Francois Hollande, all of these neoliberal people, this is what they have achieved.
David Cameron, Theresa May.
David Cameron, Theresa May, I forgot all of this. Renzi, this is what all of them have achieved.
Trudeau.
Who
we'll talk about in another video.
Video.
This whole rat pack of neoliberals.
This is what they've managed. They have created an alliance in Eurasia between two great powers, which, as I said, have aggregate resources which exceed their own.
Alexander Mercouris, Editor-in-Chief of the Duran, thank you very much. Guys, if you like this video, click on the subscribe button down below. Click on the notifications bell to make sure you get notifications every time we push out a new video. And remember to get an audio copy of this video. Follow us on iTunes and on Soundcloud as well. And you can also donate to the Duran on PayPal, Patreon, and Subscribe Star. The link to those platforms is in the description box down below, and your donation helps keep this channel up and running. And Alexander, we have magic mugs somewhere over there. All right. And I see that you are wearing the blue, or the black, sorry, the black polo with the gold eagle embroidered there, the double-headed eagle.
Exactly. Can I just talk first of all about our mugs? I mean, we've been talking, this mug here, this beautiful porcelain 15-ounce mug, has the badge of the Russian Federation. This is this is the badge that you see on the cups and mugs and that Putin drinks from. He drinks tea all the time, and he had a mug very like this one at the G20 summit. So since we've been talking about him, whilst he's been meeting with Li Keqiang, he drinks tea all the time, apparently. He's a massive tea drinker, much like I am, and he was no doubt drinking tea from a mug very like this, with this very same badge. So if you want to understand why we are able to read Putin's mind so well and are able to capture his precise thoughts and quote them to you, well, obviously we go to the Kremlin website, but also we drink from mugs like this. And if Putin is the brains, these people are Russia's mailed fist. This is Alpha Force, the badge of Alpha Force, Russia's elite special forces unit, comparable to the Navy SEALs and people like that. I mean, and the British SAS. The Russians will tell you they're even better, and they've done some pretty remarkable things. So these are fantastic mugs. If you really want to understand world affairs, to approach us in geopolitical understanding, you will drink from these mugs. And they are such good mugs that you will love doing so. And these are such good shirts that you will love wearing them. I mean, they're 100% cotton. They're beautifully dyed. They're elegantly stitched. As Alex correctly says, they have our gold. This one has our gold, our own Duran gold double-headed eagle. And of course, it points to the east, as we've discussed on this program, and the west. As we've also discussed on this program, we cover all points of the compass. My wife loves seeing me in these shirts. They are so smart and so elegant. You can buy shirts like this from our shop. You can buy mugs like this from our shop. You can buy stickers, hoodies, hats, other amazing things. Alex has recently greatly expanded the range of our products. The quality is amazing. The feedback we are getting from our customers, from our viewers who buy them, is enthusiastic. Our competitors are salivating with jealousy and are trying to copy them and are producing really bad and inferior copies, as we know. So help yourself, help the Duran, go to our shop, buy marvelous merchandise like this, buy our books. We've got books also. Alex will tell you how to do it.
Just look in the description box down below, theduranshop.com. Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of the Duran, thank you very much. Until next time, everybody, take care.